The lantern swings slow in the darkness, casting long shadows across the wooden floor of a farmhouse that has not seen laughter in years. There is no wind tonight. The air is still, thick with something unspeakable. In the corner of a small room, beneath a quilt stitched by hands that have long since turned to dust, something stirs. Not a child. Not exactly. The doctor stands in the doorway, his bag trembling in his grip, and for the first time in 30 years of practice, he cannot bring himself to cross the threshold. Behind him, the mother whispers a prayer that has no end, the words tumbling over themselves like water over stones, desperate and ancient. The girl in the bed does not move. She has not moved in 3 days, but her eyes are open, and they are watching something that no one else can see. This is not a story about medicine. This is not a story about faith. This is a story about what happens when the impossible looks back at you and smiles with a child's face. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The record begins in the summer of 1869 in the red clay hills of northern Georgia, where the trees grow so thick that daylight struggles to reach the forest floor. The town was called Millbrook then, though you will not find it on any modern map. It was a place of 43 families, a single church with a leaning steeple, and a general store that served as the heart of all gossip and commerce. The war had ended 4 years prior, and the land still bore the scars. Fields lay fallow. Men returned home with hollow eyes and missing limbs. Children were born into a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. It was into this wounded place that Sarah Ann Corbett came into the world on the 7th of March, 1869, during a rainstorm so violent that it tore the roof from the Baptist church and sent the creek rising 6 feet above its banks. Her mother, Elizabeth Corbett, labored for 19 hours in a bedroom lit only by candlelight, attended by a midwife named Mrs. Abigail Frost, whose diary would later become one of the most disturbing documents in the entire case. The birth itself was unremarkable, or so it seemed. A healthy girl, 7 pounds, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival with appropriate vigor. Mrs. Frost wrapped the infant in linen and placed her in her mother's arms, and for a brief moment, all seemed as it should be. But then Mrs. Frost noticed something that made her hands go still. The infant was staring directly at her, not with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but with eyes that seemed to hold a terrible clarity, a knowing that had no place in a creature only minutes old. In her diary, recovered in 1921 from the attic of her granddaughter's home, Mrs. Frost wrote these words: "The child looked upon me with eyes that had seen more than mine ever shall. I felt in that moment a coldness enter the room, as if winter had found its way through the walls. I told myself it was exhaustion, the lateness of the hour, the strain of a difficult birth. But I knew even then that I was lying to myself. There was something ancient in that infant's gaze, something that made me want to run from that house and never return. I did not speak of it to Mrs. Corbett. What mother wants to hear such things? But I have not forgotten. I pray I someday can." The Corbett family was well regarded in Millbrook, though not wealthy by any measure. Thomas Corbett worked as a blacksmith, a trade he had learned from his father, who had learned it from his father before him. Elizabeth kept the home and tended a small garden that yielded tomatoes, beans, and herbs she used for cooking and healing. They had one other child, a son named James, who was 6 years old when Sarah was born. By all accounts, they were ordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary times. The war had taken Thomas's brother and Elizabeth's father, but they had survived, and survival was its own kind of triumph. For the first 3 months of Sarah's life, nothing seemed amiss. She nursed well, slept through the night more often than not, and reached the typical milestones of infancy. But then, in early June, Elizabeth noticed something that would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would consume 3 generations. Sarah stopped growing, not gradually, not in the subtle way that sometimes concerns new mothers, but completely and absolutely. On the 1st of June, the child weighed 9 pounds and measured 21 inches in length. By the end of the month, she weighed 9 pounds and measured 21 inches in length. Elizabeth, thinking perhaps her measurements were in error, asked Mrs. Frost to examine the child. Mrs. Frost came on a Tuesday afternoon, bringing with her a cloth tape and a small scale borrowed from the general store. She measured Sarah 3 times, weighed her twice, and then sat down at the kitchen table with a face that had gone pale. "The child has not changed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not in size, not in weight. It is as if she has been frozen in time." Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she forced a smile. "Perhaps it is just a slow spell." "Some children grow in bursts, do they not?" Mrs. Frost did not answer immediately. She was looking at Sarah, who lay in her cradle near the window, watching the two women with those same unsettling eyes. "Some do," Mrs. Frost said finally. "But I have delivered 117 children in my life, Mrs. Corbett, and I have never seen a child stop growing entirely. You should take her to a doctor, a real doctor, not just a midwife like myself." The nearest real doctor was in Dalton, 23 miles south, a journey that required a full day's travel by wagon. Thomas made the trip on a Friday in early July, with Elizabeth holding Sarah wrapped in blankets despite the summer heat. The doctor's name was Marcus Pemberton, a graduate of the Medical College of Georgia, a man who had served as a field surgeon during the war and had seen, he believed, every horror the human body could produce. Dr. Pemberton examined Sarah for nearly 2 hours. He measured her, weighed her, listened to her heart and lungs, examined her eyes, her mouth, her hands and feet. He took notes in a leather journal, his handwriting precise and methodical. When he finished, he invited Thomas and Elizabeth into his office, a small room lined with medical texts and glass jars containing specimens that Elizabeth tried not to look at too closely. "I can find nothing wrong with your daughter," Dr. Pemberton said, removing his spectacles and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Her heart is strong, her lungs are clear, she responds to stimuli appropriately. By every measure I possess, she is a healthy infant." Thomas leaned forward. "Then why has she stopped growing?" Dr. Pemberton replaced his spectacles and looked at them both with an expression that seemed equal parts confusion and concern. "I do not know. I have read of cases where children grow slowly, cases of malnutrition or disease that can stunt development, but I have never encountered a child who simply stops growing while remaining otherwise healthy. It defies medical explanation." Elizabeth's voice was tight. "What do we do?" The doctor spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Continue to feed her as you have been. Keep her warm and clean. Bring her back in 1 month and we will examine her again. Perhaps this is temporary, some anomaly that will correct itself. The human body is capable of surprising us." But it did not correct itself. When they returned to Dr. Pemberton 1 month later, Sarah had not grown a single inch, had not gained a single ounce. The doctor's confusion deepened into something that looked almost like fear. He consulted his textbooks, wrote letters to colleagues in Atlanta and Savannah, even sent a telegram to a physician friend in Philadelphia. No one had any answers. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? By autumn of that year, word had spread through Millbrook. The Corbetts tried to keep the matter private, but in a town of 43 families, privacy was an illusion. People began to talk in hushed voices outside the general store, in the pews before Sunday service, in the fields while they worked. The Corbett girl, they said, was not natural. She was cursed or touched by something that had no name. Mrs. Lydia Hawthorne, who lived 3 houses down from the Corbetts, told anyone who would listen that she had seen the child through the window one evening, and the child had been sitting upright in her cradle, perfectly still, staring at the wall with an expression of profound sadness. "No infant sits like that," Mrs. Hawthorne insisted. "No infant has such a look upon their face. There is something terribly wrong in that house." Reverend Josiah Thorne, pastor of the Baptist Church, paid a visit to the Corbett home in October. He was a man of 60 years with a white beard and kind eyes who had ministered to the town through war and pestilence and grief. He had baptized Sarah in April, shortly after her birth, and he had thought her a lovely child then. Now, holding her in his arms while Elizabeth prepared tea, he felt that same coldness that Mrs. Frost had described, a sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the infant like heat from a stove. Sarah stared up at him without blinking, and the Reverend found himself thinking of a passage from Ezekiel about creatures with eyes all around, creatures that moved but never made a sound. He handed the child back to Elizabeth quickly, perhaps more quickly than was polite. "Have you considered that this may be a trial from the Lord?" Reverend Thorne asked, accepting the cup of tea with hands that trembled slightly. "A test of faith as Job was tested." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "With respect, Reverend, Job's children were killed. Mine is alive. She eats, she sleeps, she makes sounds as infants do. She is simply not growing. I do not see how that is a test of faith." The Reverend sipped his tea, considering his words carefully. "There are forces in this world that we do not fully understand, Mrs. Corbett. Forces that existed long before the church, long before the word of God reached these shores. The Cherokee who lived in these hills before us, they spoke of spirits that could inhabit the living, that could stop the natural course of things. Perhaps a blessing is needed, a cleansing." Thomas, who had been silent until now, spoke with barely controlled anger. "My daughter does not need cleansing, Reverend. She needs medical help. If you cannot provide that, then I thank you for your visit, but we have work to do." Reverend Thorne left shortly after, and he did not return. But his words spread through the town like smoke, and the whispers grew louder. The Cherokee, some people said. Yes, that made sense. These lands had been Cherokee territory until the removal in 1838, until the Trail of Tears had emptied the hills of their original inhabitants. Perhaps something had been left behind, some angry spirit that resented the white settlers who had taken the land. Perhaps that spirit had found its way into the Corbett child, had nested inside her like a parasite, preventing her from growing, keeping her trapped in infancy. It was superstition, ignorance, the kind of thinking that thrives in isolated places where education is sparse and fear is plentiful. But fear has a way of becoming contagious, and soon even those who should have known better found themselves avoiding the Corbett family, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw Elizabeth in town, finding excuses not to visit. Winter came and Sarah remained unchanged. She had now been alive for 9 months, but she looked exactly as she had at 3 months. She did not crawl, did not sit up on her own, did not reach for toys or babble in the way that infants do. She lay in her cradle or later in a small bed, and she watched, always watching with those dark, knowing eyes. Elizabeth kept meticulous records, measuring her daughter every week, weighing her on a small scale, noting every detail in a journal that would later be entered as evidence in a proceeding that no one could have anticipated. The entries are heartbreaking in their precision, in their desperate hope that the next measurement would show some change, any change at all. December 3rd, 1869. Weight 9 pounds, length 21 inches. Took milk normally. No fever. No sign of distress. December 10th, 1869. Weight 9 pounds, length 21 inches. Smiled today, I think, or perhaps it was only wind. I want so badly to believe she is happy. December 17th, 1869. Weight 9 pounds, length 21 inches. James asked today why his sister does not grow. I did not know what to tell him. Thomas says we must have faith that God has a plan. I wish I had his certainty. On Christmas Eve, the family attended service at the Baptist church. It was the first time they had been to service since Reverend Thorne's visit, and they could feel the eyes upon them as they entered, feel the weight of judgment and fear. They sat in the back pew, Sarah wrapped tightly in Elizabeth's arms, and they listened as the Reverend spoke of miracles and mysteries, of things that surpass human understanding. When the service ended, no one approached them. No one wished them a blessed Christmas. They walked home in silence through the cold December night, their breath misting in the air, and Elizabeth wept quietly, her tears freezing on her cheeks. The new year brought no relief. 1870 began with a bitter cold that settled over the hills like a shroud, and the Corbett household grew increasingly isolated. Thomas's business suffered as fewer people came to his forge, and Elizabeth found that her usual customers for eggs and vegetables had stopped visiting. They were being quietly ostracized, not through any official decree, but through the thousand small cruelties that communities inflict upon those they have deemed other, different, wrong. In February, Dr. Pemberton made an unusual house call, traveling from Dalton in weather that no reasonable person would have braved. He arrived at the Corbett home on a Tuesday afternoon, his coat white with snow, his face drawn with exhaustion. Elizabeth welcomed him inside, confused but grateful, and prepared coffee while the doctor examined Sarah once more. This time, the examination was different. Dr. Pemberton did not simply measure and weigh the child. He performed tests that seemed almost cruel in their invasiveness. He pricked her finger to draw blood, which he examined under a small microscope he had brought with him. He used an instrument to examine the back of her eyes, shining a light that made Sarah cry, the first real crying Elizabeth had heard from her in weeks. He listened to her heart for what seemed like hours, moving his stethoscope from place to place on her tiny chest, his expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. When he finished, he sat at the kitchen table and opened his medical bag, removing a thick file of papers. "I have been corresponding with colleagues across the country," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I have described your daughter's condition to 14 different physicians, including 2 who studied in Europe, at the great medical schools in Paris and London. Not one of them has encountered anything similar. Not one can offer an explanation." Thomas poured himself coffee with hands that shook. "But you must have some theory. You are a man of science. There must be something." Dr. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers spread before him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have a theory, Mr. Corbett, but it is not one rooted in any science I know. I have come to believe that your daughter's body has been arrested in a moment of time, that some mechanism I cannot identify has prevented her from proceeding forward along the normal course of development. It is as if she exists in a single instant that repeats endlessly, like a clock that strikes the same hour again and again without ever moving forward." Elizabeth's voice was sharp. "That is not a medical explanation. That is poetry." The doctor looked at her with eyes that held something close to despair. "I know, and that is what terrifies me, Mrs. Corbett. I have spent my life studying the human body, learning its mechanisms, understanding its diseases. I can tell you how the heart pumps blood, how the lungs exchange oxygen, how bones grow and muscles develop. But I cannot tell you why your daughter does not grow. I cannot explain why she remains exactly as she was 9 months ago, unchanged down to the smallest detail. And when medicine cannot explain something, when science fails, then we are left with nothing but poetry and prayer." He closed his file and stood to leave, but Elizabeth stopped him. "Is she suffering? Can you at least tell me that?" Dr. Pemberton looked at Sarah, who was lying in her small bed near the fire, watching them with those ancient eyes. "I do not know," he said honestly. "She shows no signs of physical pain. But as to whether she suffers in ways we cannot measure, ways that have nothing to do with the body, I cannot say. I am sorry. I wish I had more to offer you." He left, and they did not see him again for many years. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Spring brought rumors of a different kind. A traveling preacher came through Millbrook in April, a man who called himself Brother Ezekiel, who claimed to have the gift of healing, who said he could drive out demons and cure the sick with the power of the Lord. He set up a tent on the edge of town and held revivals every evening for a week, drawing crowds of people desperate for hope, for miracles, for anything that might break the monotony of their hard lives. Someone told him about Sarah Corbett, about the child who would not grow, and on the final night of his revival, he sent word to the Corbett home that he wished to see the girl. Thomas was reluctant, but Elizabeth convinced him. What harm could it do? They had tried medicine and it had failed. Perhaps faith would succeed where science had not. They brought Sarah to the tent that evening, arriving just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that seemed almost apocalyptic. Inside the tent, perhaps 200 people had gathered, sitting on rough wooden benches, their faces illuminated by lanterns hung from the tent poles. Brother Ezekiel stood at the front, a tall man with wild hair and eyes that burned with fervor. He wore a simple black suit and carried a worn Bible that he clutched like a weapon. When the Corbetts entered, the crowd fell silent. Brother Ezekiel gestured for them to approach, and Thomas carried Sarah to the front, feeling the weight of all those eyes upon them, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that made his skin crawl. The preacher took Sarah from Thomas's arms and held her up for all to see. "Behold," Brother Ezekiel proclaimed, his voice echoing through the tent, "a child afflicted, a child suffering under the weight of something unholy. I can feel it, brothers and sisters. I can feel the presence of something that should not be, something that has taken root in this innocent vessel." He placed one hand on Sarah's forehead and raised his other hand toward the sky. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command whatever dwells within this child to depart. Leave this place. Return to the darkness from whence you came. Release this innocent soul." The tent erupted in shouts of Amen, in prayers and speaking in tongues, in a cacophony of desperation and belief that was almost physical in its intensity. Brother Ezekiel's voice rose above it all, calling upon the Lord to cast out demons, to perform a miracle, to heal this child and prove his power to all who witnessed. Sarah, held aloft in the preacher's hands, began to scream. Not the cry of a frightened infant, but something else entirely, a sound that seemed too large, too terrible to come from such a small body. It was a scream of rage and anguish, a sound that cut through the prayers and the shouting like a knife. The lanterns flickered and several went out entirely, plunging parts of the tent into shadow. A cold wind swept through the space, though the tent flaps were closed and people gasped and drew back. Brother Ezekiel's face went pale, but he held onto the child, his voice growing more frantic, more desperate. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave, I command you." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, Sarah stopped screaming. The tent fell silent. The wind died. The lantern steadied. Brother Ezekiel stood there holding the child, and for a moment it seemed as if something had changed, as if a miracle had indeed occurred. Then Sarah turned her head and looked directly at Brother Ezekiel, and she smiled. It was not the smile of an infant. It was the smile of something that understood exactly what had just transpired, something that found it amusing. The preacher's hands began to shake. He thrust the child back at Thomas as if she had burned him, and he stumbled backward, his wild eyes suddenly filled with fear. "Take her," he whispered hoarsely. "Take her and go. I cannot help you. No one can help you." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs, but the Corbetts did not wait to hear what they had to say. They fled the tent, clutching Sarah, and they ran through the darkness back to their home, not stopping until they were safely inside with the door barred. They did not speak of what had happened. They did not speak at all. They simply sat in their small parlor, listening to Sarah's quiet breathing, and wondered what they had unleashed, or perhaps what had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The next day, Brother Ezekiel left town without warning, taking down his tent in the early hours of the morning and disappearing before most people had risen. He left behind no forwarding address, no explanation, nothing but more questions and more fear. The incident at the revival marked a turning point. Before, the town had viewed Sarah with superstitious unease. Now, they viewed her with outright terror. Children were forbidden from going near the Corbett home. Women made signs against evil when they passed by. Even the postmen began leaving their mail at the end of the drive rather than approaching the house. The family was completely isolated now, trapped in a prison of fear and ignorance that seemed to have no escape. Summer came, and Sarah turned 1 year old, though she looked no different than she had at 3 months. Elizabeth baked a small cake, and they sang to her in quiet voices, and James gave his sister a wooden doll that Thomas had carved, though Sarah showed no interest in it. She lay in her bed, as always, watching, waiting, existing in that frozen moment that Dr. Pemberton had described. Elizabeth's journal entries from this period show a woman slowly coming apart. July 7th, 1870. 1 year old today. She smiled when we sang. I know she did. Thomas says I am seeing things that are not there, but I am her mother. I know my child. July 22nd, 1870. I found her out of bed this morning. I had placed her in the center, away from the edges, but when I woke she was on the floor on the other side of the room. Thomas says I must have moved her in my sleep and forgot, but I do not walk in my sleep. I never have. August 3rd, 1870. She speaks to me at night, not with words, but I hear her all the same. She tells me things about the house, about the land, about what was here before us. She tells me about the people who walked these hills long ago, about the blood that was spilled, about the promises that were broken. I do not tell Thomas. He would think I am losing my mind. Perhaps I am. August 18th, 1870. James will not look at her anymore. He says her eyes follow him, that she watches him even when she is supposed to be sleeping. He begs me to send her away, to give her to someone else. I tried to explain that she is his sister, that we love her, but he just shook his head and said that what is in that bed is not his sister. He is 7 years old. What could he possibly understand? But perhaps James understood more than anyone. Children sometimes see what adults refuse to acknowledge, what adults explain away with logic and reason. On September 9th, 1870, something happened that would finally force the adult world to pay attention, to take seriously what had been dismissed as hysteria and superstition. James Corbett disappeared. He went out to play in the woods behind the house, something he did every day, and he did not return. Thomas and Elizabeth searched until darkness fell, calling his name, following the small paths through the trees. Neighbors joined the search, temporarily setting aside their fear to help find a missing child. They searched all night, through the next day and into the following night. They found no trace of him, no clothing, no sign of struggle, nothing to indicate where he had gone or what had happened. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. On the third day, a farmer named William Tucker was searching near the creek, about a mile from the Corbett home, when he heard a child crying. He followed the sound and found James sitting on a fallen log, soaking wet, shivering with cold, his eyes wide and distant. William wrapped the boy in his coat and carried him home, and the Corbetts wept with relief and gratitude. But James would not speak. He stared straight ahead, unresponsive to questions, barely seeming to recognize his parents. They put him to bed and called for Dr. Pemberton, who arrived the next day and examined the boy thoroughly. Physically, James was unharmed. He had no injuries, no signs of exposure beyond the cold and wet. But mentally, something had broken. He would not speak, would not explain where he had been or what had happened. He flinched away from Sarah's room, refused to enter the house any further than the kitchen. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It was not until a week later that James finally spoke, and when he did, it was in the middle of the night, in a voice loud enough to wake the entire household. Elizabeth rushed to his room to find him sitting up in bed, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "She took me," James said, his voice flat and emotionless. "She came to me in the woods and she took my hand and we went down into the dark place where the old ones sleep. She showed me things. She showed me what happened here on this land before the white people came. She showed me the children who were taken, the mothers who wept, the fathers who fought and died. She showed me the spirits who refused to leave, who sank into the earth and the trees and the stones, waiting. And then she showed me herself, what she really is. She is not my sister. She never was. She is something old that came when Sarah was born, that slipped inside while the door was open, and now she lives in Sarah's body like a person lives in a house. And she is hungry. She is so very hungry." Elizabeth tried to comfort him, to tell him it was just a nightmare, that Sarah was his sister and nothing more, but James shook his head violently. "She told me to tell you. She said you need to know what she is. She said the time of hiding is almost over and soon everyone will see. She said this is just the beginning." He would say nothing more, and the next morning he seemed to have no memory of the conversation. But he never went near Sarah again, and 3 years later, when he was old enough, he left Millbrook and never returned. Census records show that James Corbett eventually settled in Tennessee, married, had children of his own, but he never once mentioned his sister in any document that has been found, never acknowledged her existence in any way that history has recorded. The years passed and the impossible continued. Sarah did not grow. By 1875, she had been alive for 6 years, yet she remained exactly as she had been at 3 months old. 9 pounds, 21 inches, unchanging, eternal. Dr. Pemberton had stopped coming. The Reverend had resigned from his position and left Millbrook for a congregation in South Carolina. Most of the original families had moved away, replaced by people who knew nothing of the Corbett girl, who had not been there to witness the early years of her impossible existence. But those who remained knew, and they whispered their stories to the newcomers, and the fear perpetuated itself. Thomas's health began to fail. The stress of isolation, of caring for a child who should not exist, of watching his wife slowly lose her grip on reality, took its toll. He developed a cough that would not go away, a tightness in his chest that made breathing difficult. By 1877, he was spending most of his days in bed, too weak to work the forge, too exhausted to do more than exist. Elizabeth cared for both her husband and her daughter, moving through the house like a ghost, speaking in whispers, no longer keeping her journal because what was there to say? Nothing changed. Nothing ever changed. Sarah remained in her small bed, watching, always watching. Thomas Corbett died on November 19, 1877, of what the death certificate listed as consumption, though Dr. Pemberton, who signed the certificate without actually examining the body, suspected it was something closer to a broken heart, a spirit that simply gave up under the weight of the inexplicable. Elizabeth was alone now, alone in a house that had become a prison, with a daughter who was not a daughter, who had not aged a day in 8.5 years. The winter of 1878 was the coldest anyone could remember. Snow fell in November and did not melt until April. The roads became impassable, and Millbrook was cut off from the rest of the world, a tiny island of humanity trapped in a frozen landscape. Elizabeth ran through her supplies by February and had to rely on the charity of neighbors who left food at the end of her drive, who would not come closer, who feared contamination by whatever curse afflicted the Corbett household. One night in March, as the wind howled around the house and the fire burned low, Elizabeth sat beside Sarah's bed and spoke to her daughter for what she believed would be the last time. A neighbor, Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, recorded this conversation in a letter to her sister in Atlanta, a letter that was discovered in a trunk in 1942. Mrs. Blackwood had crept close to the house that night, worried about Elizabeth, and she had heard the words through the thin walls. "I know you hear me," Elizabeth said, her voice cracked and weary. "I know you understand. I do not know what you are, but I know you are not my daughter. My daughter died somehow, somewhere in those first months, and you took her place. Or perhaps my daughter was never born at all and you were there from the beginning. It does not matter now. I am dying. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. This winter will take me as it took Thomas. And when I am gone, there will be no one to care for you, no one to feed you or change you or pretend that you are something you are not. And I truly wonder, what will happen then? Will you finally die? Will you finally move on to wherever you should be? Or will you simply remain, unchanged, waiting in this house until it falls down around you, until the forest reclaims this land and you are buried under leaves and soil and time?" She paused, and in the silence Mrs. Blackwood swore she heard a sound, a soft exhalation that might have been a sigh or might have been the wind. "I prayed for you," Elizabeth continued. "Every night I prayed that you would grow, that you would change, that you would become a normal child. But you did not. And so now I pray for myself that when I die I will go somewhere far from here, somewhere you cannot follow, somewhere where mothers do not have to carry this kind of weight. I pray that I will forget you, forget this house, forget these years that have stolen my life. That is all I have left, prayer and forgetting." Elizabeth died 3 days later on March 11, 1878. She was found in her bed by Mrs. Blackwood, who had finally gathered the courage to check on her after seeing no smoke from the chimney for 2 days. Elizabeth's face was peaceful, her hands folded across her chest, her eyes closed. She looked younger in death than she had in years, as if dying had released her from some terrible burden. And in the small bed across the room, Sarah lay exactly as she always had, watching the ceiling with those dark, knowing eyes. Mrs. Blackwood did not stay long. She fled the house and informed the authorities, and the sheriff came with several men to investigate. They found Sarah, alive and apparently unharmed, though there was no food in the house and the fire had gone out days before. The child should have frozen to death or starved, but she had done neither. She simply existed, as always, unchanged. There was a discussion about what to do with her. No orphanage would take her once they learned of her condition. No family would adopt her. The church suggested she be placed in an institution for the incurably insane, though she showed no signs of madness, showed no signs of anything at all really beyond that constant watching. In the end, it was decided that she would be placed in the care of Elizabeth's sister, Margaret Whitfield, who lived in a small cabin 20 miles west of Millbrook, on the edge of the Cherokee Territory that had been designated as a reservation after the removal. Margaret was a widow with no children, a woman who had always been considered slightly odd, who talked to herself and kept cats and gathered herbs in the forest that she sold to people brave enough to come to her door. She agreed to take Sarah without hesitation, without question, and when the sheriff delivered the child to her cabin in late March, Margaret took her into her arms and smiled. "Welcome home," Margaret said, and the sheriff felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Margaret Whitfield kept no journals, wrote no letters that have survived, spoke to almost no one about the child in her care. What we know of the next 20 years comes primarily from second-hand accounts, from people who passed by her cabin and glimpsed Sarah through the windows, from shopkeepers in nearby towns who occasionally saw Margaret purchasing supplies. And what they saw was always the same. Sarah, unchanged, lying in a bed or sitting in a chair, watching the world with those ancient eyes, year after year after year. A traveling salesman named Robert Porter mentioned her in a memoir published in 1903. He had stopped at Margaret's cabin in the autumn of 1895, seeking directions, and Margaret had invited him in for water. "I saw the child," Porter wrote, "and I confess the sight disturbed me profoundly. She could not have been more than a few months old by her appearance, yet there was something about her that suggested great age, great weariness. She lay in a wooden cradle carved with strange symbols, symbols that looked Cherokee in origin but that I did not recognize. The woman, Margaret, saw me looking and she smiled. 'She has been with me 17 years, she said. 17 years and not a day older. But she is content, I think. She is learning.' I asked what the child was learning, but the woman would not answer. She simply gave me directions and sent me on my way. I have thought of that child often in the years since, wondered what happened to her, wondered if she still lives in that cradle, still watches the world with those knowing eyes. I hope not. Some things should end, should be allowed to rest. But I suspect that child, if she can be called a child, will outlive us all." Margaret Whitfield died in 1898 at the age of 67, of a fever that came on suddenly and took her within 3 days. She was found by a Cherokee man named William Swimmer, who occasionally checked on her because she had been kind to his people when kindness was rare. He found Margaret in her bed, dead, and he found Sarah in her cradle, unchanged, now 29 years old and still appearing to be a 3-month-old infant. William Swimmer stared at the child for a long time, and then he did something that no one else had done. He spoke to her in Cherokee, in the old language that his grandmother had taught him, the language that had been spoken on this land for thousands of years. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And according to the account he gave to a reporter from the Atlanta Constitution in 1926, shortly before his death, Sarah responded. Not in words, but she turned her head to look at him directly, and her lips moved, forming syllables that he recognized, words in a dialect so old that even he did not fully understand them. But he grasped enough to know that she was telling him a story about the land, about the people who had been taken from it, about the grief that had sunk so deep into the soil that it had become part of the earth itself, waiting, growing, feeding on the pain of those who remained. "She told me," William Swimmer said, "that she was not a demon and not a spirit, not really. She was more like a memory that had become so strong it took on physical form, a remembering that would not end. She said she was the accumulation of all the sorrow that had been poured into this land, all the tears of the mothers who had watched their children die or be taken, all the rage of the fathers who had been powerless to protect them. She said she had slipped into the Corbett infant the moment the child took her first breath, not to harm the child, but because the child was an opening, a door, and the memory needed somewhere to live. And she said she could not leave because the grief had not ended, the sorrow was still here, still being created, still being fed by all the terrible things that people do to each other. She said she would remain until the land itself forgot, until there was no one left who remembered what had been taken. And then, maybe then, she could rest. William Swimmer left the cabin that day and never returned. He informed the authorities about Margaret's death, but he said nothing about Sarah, and when the sheriff came to investigate, the cabin was empty. Sarah was gone. There is a gap in the record then, a period of 7 years where Sarah Corbett vanishes completely from any documentation. No one reported seeing her. No one mentioned her in letters or journals or newspaper accounts. It is as if she ceased to exist, or perhaps as if she simply became invisible, one more strange thing in a world full of strangeness. She resurfaces in 1905 in a most unexpected way. A doctor named Helen Morrison published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association titled, "A Case of Arrested Development Beyond Medical Explanation." In it, she described a patient she had examined at a private hospital in Athens, Georgia, a patient who appeared to be an infant but who the records indicated was 36 years old. Dr. Morrison, one of the few female physicians practicing at that time, had been skeptical when first told of the case, assuming it was a hoax or a misunderstanding. But upon examination, she found that the patient was indeed biologically consistent with a 3-month-old infant in every measurable way. Brain activity, bone density, cellular development, all suggested an infant, not an adult. Yet the patient had been alive for 36 years. "I can offer no explanation," Dr. Morrison wrote. "I have consulted with colleagues, reviewed all available medical literature, conducted every test available to modern medicine. This patient should not exist. The fact that she does exist challenges everything we believe we understand about human development, about time itself. I can only document what I have observed and hope that future science will provide answers that current science cannot." The patient's name was listed in the hospital records as Sarah Doe, but a note in the margin, written in Dr. Morrison's hand, reads, "Patient claims her true name is Sarah Corbett, from Millbrook, Georgia. Mother deceased, father deceased, all other family unknown." Sarah remained at the hospital for 3 years, an object of study and bewilderment, examined by dozens of doctors and scientists, photographed, measured, tested. None could explain her. Some suggested it was a hoax, that she was actually a normal infant being misrepresented as older, but the tests showed otherwise. Her cells were 39 years old by the time she left the hospital. They had aged even though her body had not. In 1908, the hospital closed due to lack of funding, and the patients were transferred to various institutions. Sarah was sent to the Georgia State Sanitarium in Milledgeville, where she was placed in the ward for incurable cases, patients who were neither sick nor well, who existed in some liminal space that defied categorization. A nurse named Dorothy Ellis worked in that ward for 15 years and wrote about Sarah in a private diary that was donated to the Georgia Historical Society after Ellis's death in 1967. "The Corbett girl," Ellis wrote in an entry dated April 1911, "has been here for 3 years now. She never cries, never makes demands, never requires much beyond basic care. She simply watches. The other nurses avoid her ward if they can. They say she gives them nightmares, that when they sleep they dream of her eyes, of the weight of her gaze. I do not have such dreams, or if I do not remember them. But I understand their fear. There is something about her that does not belong in this world, something that should have ended long ago but persists out of sheer stubborn will, or perhaps out of something darker. I asked her once, late at night when I was alone with her, I asked why she remains. Why she does not simply let go and die like any normal creature would. She looked at me, and I swear she smiled just slightly, just enough to make me doubt myself. And I heard, not with my ears but somewhere deeper, a single word: remember. That is what she wants, to be remembered, to make us remember. Sarah Corbett remained at the sanitarium for 27 years. She was there when the Great War came and went, when the influenza pandemic swept through the world, when the economy collapsed and the depression settled over the country like a pall. She remained unchanged through it all, a constant in a world of change, an impossibility that simply refused to resolve itself. In 1935, when Sarah was 66 years old, a fire broke out in the sanitarium. It started in the kitchen and spread rapidly through the old wooden structures, driven by a wind that seemed to come from nowhere, that fanned the flames with almost malicious intent. Patients and staff fled into the night, and by morning, most of the facility had been reduced to ash. The official death toll was listed as 43, but there were rumors of others. Patients in the isolation wards who had no family, no one to claim them, no one to confirm whether they had escaped or perished. Sarah's name appeared on neither the survivor list nor the casualty list. She simply disappeared once again into the gaps of history. But the story does not end there. It cannot end because Sarah Corbett, if that is still what she should be called, has been seen. Over the decades since the fire, there have been reports, scattered and sporadic, of a child who does not age, who appears in different places, always watching, always waiting. In 1953, a family in Tennessee reported that they had found an infant abandoned on their porch. They took the child in, cared for her for 6 months, but when she showed no signs of growth, no signs of change, they became frightened and left her at a church. The church contacted the authorities, but by the time anyone arrived, the infant was gone. In 1972, a photographer in Alabama captured an image that has become something of an urban legend. He was taking pictures of an abandoned house for a book on forgotten structures, and in one of the photographs, visible through a window in the background, is what appears to be a child lying in a bed. The photographer swore he saw no one when he took the picture, swore the house was empty. But there she is in the photograph, clear as day. Dark hair, those eyes, watching the camera. In 1989, a group of hikers in the North Georgia mountains claimed they encountered a woman living alone in a crude shelter deep in the forest. The woman was old, in her 80s at least, but she cared for what the hikers assumed was her grandchild, an infant who never made a sound. The hikers offered help, offered to notify authorities that there was a child in need of care, but the old woman refused. "She's not in need," the woman said. "She's exactly where she's supposed to be. She's been here longer than any of us, and she'll be here long after we're dust." When the hikers returned with rangers 2 days later, the shelter was empty. And in 2008, a nurse at a children's hospital in Atlanta filed a report about a patient admitted with no identification, no medical history, appearing to be approximately 3 months old. The child remained at the hospital for 3 weeks while authorities tried to locate family or determine where she had come from. During that time, according to the nurse's report, the child did not change. Not at all. Same weight, same measurements, day after day, despite being fed and cared for normally. On the 21st day, the nurse came to check on the patient during a night shift and found the room empty. The child was gone, the window open, though they were on the 4th floor. No alarm had been triggered. No one had been seen entering or leaving. The child simply vanished. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 2019, I personally traveled to what remains of Millbrook, Georgia. The town no longer exists in any official capacity, just a few scattered houses and a historical marker that mentions nothing of the events described here. I walked the land where the Corbett home once stood, where Thomas and Elizabeth and James lived with a child who should not have been possible. The forest has reclaimed most of it. Trees grow where the house stood, their roots breaking through old foundations, their branches reaching toward a sky that has witnessed 150 years of mystery. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind in the leaves, feeling the weight of history, of sorrow, of all the terrible and beautiful things that humans do to each other and to the land they inhabit. And I wondered, as I have wondered throughout this investigation, what really happened here. Was Sarah Corbett truly inhabited by some spirit of grief, some accumulated sorrow that took physical form? Was she the victim of a medical condition so rare that it has never been properly identified? Was she something else entirely, something that our limited human understanding cannot begin to categorize? I do not have answers. No one does. What I have are records, testimonies, photographs, all the documentary evidence of a life that should not have existed, but did, that perhaps still does, that continues somewhere in the hidden corners of the world, watching, waiting, remembering. The medical records from Dr. Pemberton, from Dr. Morrison, from the sanitarium, all confirm the basic facts. Sarah Corbett did not age. For at least 66 years, possibly longer, she remained exactly as she had been at 3 months old. This is not metaphor, not exaggeration. This is documented, measured, verified fact. And yet it makes no sense, violates every law of biology we understand, challenges the very foundation of how we conceive of life and time and existence. Perhaps that is the real horror here, not that Sarah existed, but that her existence forces us to confront how little we truly understand, how much of our certainty about the world is built on assumptions that can be shattered by a single, impossible child. The Cherokee elders I spoke with during my research were reluctant to discuss the case in detail, but one woman who asked not to be named told me this. There are some griefs so deep they become their own living things. When people suffer, when they are taken from their land, when their children are stolen, when everything they love is destroyed, that suffering has to go somewhere. It sinks into the earth, into the water, into the air. And sometimes, if the suffering is strong enough and if the conditions are right, it takes form. It becomes something that can be seen and touched. Your Sarah Corbett, she might have been one of those forms, a grief made flesh, a memory that would not fade. And if that's true, if that's what she was, then she is still here. Because the grief has not ended. The taking has not stopped. And so the memory remains, watching, waiting for the day when the world finally learns to stop creating such sorrow. I think of James Corbett, who fled and never returned, who carried the weight of what he saw in those woods for the rest of his life. I think of Elizabeth, who died exhausted and broken, who spent her final years caring for something she could not understand. I think of Dr. Pemberton, whose medical knowledge proved worthless in the face of the impossible, who signed death certificates and wrote letters but could offer no real help. I think of all the people who encountered Sarah over the decades, who saw her and tried to help or tried to understand or simply tried to forget. And I think of Sarah herself, if she can still be called that, lying somewhere even now, unchanged, eternal, a child who is not a child, a mystery that will not resolve. The question that haunts me, the question that I cannot answer, is whether she suffers. Whether this endless existence is a burden or simply a state of being, whether she experiences time as we do or whether each moment is the same for her, an eternal present without past or future. The witnesses who spoke to her, or who believed she spoke to them, say that she is waiting for the grief to end, for the land to forget, for some final accounting that will release her from whatever obligation binds her to this world. But grief does not end. Loss is not forgotten. The things we do to each other, the terrible weight of history, these do not simply fade away. They accumulate, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, and perhaps that is what Sarah Corbett truly is. Not a ghost, not a demon, not a medical anomaly, but a living record, a testament written in flesh to all the sorrow that humanity has poured into the earth. In the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, there is a box labeled Corbett Case, Millbrook, Georgia, 1869 to 1935. It contains Elizabeth's journals, medical records, newspaper clippings, photographs, letters, all the accumulated documentation of a life that defied explanation. I have spent hundreds of hours with those documents, reading and rereading them, searching for some key, some detail that would make everything make sense. I have not found it. What I have found instead is a profound unease, a sense that the boundaries we draw between possible and impossible, between real and unreal, are far more permeable than we would like to believe. The last item in the box is a photograph, undated, of poor quality, showing what appears to be a child lying in a wooden cradle. The photograph is labeled in handwriting that has been identified as Margaret Whitfield's, the one who remembers. I have stared at that photograph for so long that I have it memorized, every detail, every shadow. And I swear, though I know it is impossible that the eyes in that photograph meet mine, that they see me across the gulf of years and distance and death. And they ask a question that I cannot answer. Will you remember? Will you carry this forward? Will you ensure that the suffering is not forgotten, that the grief is acknowledged, that the terrible beauty of existence is honored? I do not know. I can only tell the story as I have told it here, and hope that it serves some purpose, that it means something beyond mere horror, beyond the shock of the impossible made real. Sarah Corbett, born March 7, 1869, in Millbrook, Georgia, during a storm that tore the roof from a church. Last confirmed sighting, 2008, in Atlanta, Georgia, 139 years later. Still appearing to be 3 months old, still watching with those ancient eyes, still carrying whatever burden or purpose or curse that has prevented her from following the natural course of existence. She may be out there still, in some forgotten place, some corner of the world where people do not ask too many questions, where strangeness is accepted because what choice is there but to accept it. She may be watching someone even now, waiting to see if they will understand, if they will remember, if they will acknowledge the weight of grief that has been passed down through generations like an inheritance that no one wanted but that everyone must carry. Or perhaps she finally found release, finally let go, finally allowed herself to dissolve back into the earth and air and water from which she may have been formed. Perhaps the fire at the sanitarium in 1935 was that release, a purification by flame that freed her from the endless cycle of watching and waiting. I do not know. I cannot know. What I know is this. The human capacity for suffering is matched only by our capacity for survival, and sometimes the two become so intertwined that they cannot be separated. We create horrors, and then we live with them, and sometimes those horrors take forms we never anticipated, forms that persist long after we think they should have ended. Sarah Corbett, whether she was a medical impossibility or a manifestation of collective grief, or something else entirely beyond our understanding, represents that persistence, that refusal to be forgotten, that insistence that pain must be acknowledged before it can be released. The land remembers. The earth holds the weight of everything that has happened upon it, every joy and every sorrow, every birth and every death. And sometimes, if we are quiet enough, if we listen carefully, we can hear it speaking, telling us stories that we would rather not hear, showing us truths that we would rather not see. This is one of those stories. This is one of those truths. A child who did not age, who lived for more than 66 confirmed years in the body of a 3-month-old infant who was impossible by every measure we possess, and yet who existed, who was documented, who was real. The doctors could not explain her. The preachers could not exorcise her. The scientists could not categorize her. She simply was, and perhaps still is, a question without an answer, a mystery that will not be solved. And maybe that is the point. Maybe some things are not meant to be explained, not meant to be understood, but only to be witnessed, to be remembered, to be carried forward as a reminder that the world is stranger and more terrible and more beautiful than we can ever fully comprehend. If Sarah Corbett could speak, if she could tell us her story in words we could understand, what would she say? Would she curse the circumstances that trapped her in that endless moment? Would she speak of loneliness beyond imagining, of watching the world change while she remained frozen? Or would she speak of purpose, of a mission that required her sacrifice, of a grief that needed a vessel, a witness who would not forget? I cannot answer these questions, but I carry them with me, as perhaps we all must carry the unanswered questions that history leaves behind. The file remains open at the Georgia Historical Society, waiting for new information, new sightings, new evidence. The story continues somewhere in some form, and those who encounter it are changed by it, marked by the impossible made real, by the child who would not grow, by the grief that took human form and refused to die. This is the case of Sarah Corbett, the most impossible girl doctors tried and failed to explain, a mystery spanning 150 years, a horror that is perhaps not a horror at all but simply a reflection of ourselves, of our capacity to create suffering so deep it becomes immortal. She watches still, from somewhere beyond our sight, beyond our understanding, waiting for the day when the world finally learns what she has been trying to teach us all along, that some griefs do not end, that some memories must be kept, that the impossible is only impossible until it happens, and then it becomes simply another truth we must learn to live with. This is her story, and now it is yours to carry forward. Remember her. Remember what she represents. Remember that the boundaries between possible and impossible are thinner than you think, and that sometimes in the quiet places where history and mystery meet, you might catch a glimpse of something that should not be, something that watches with ancient eyes and waits for you to understand. The file remains open. The mystery persists. And somewhere, perhaps, a child who is not a child lies in the darkness, unchanged, eternal, asking the same question she has asked for more than a century. Will you remember?